This is the Do You Know Him podcast. This is Lowell King. I'll be your host. Today's story is called Lost. I guess I was one of those children when I was little that a lot of times the parents wouldn't tell them in advance that they were going to do something exciting because I had a real problem sleeping at night. I remember Christmas time, for 2 or 3 days before Christmas, I just would not sleep right at night. And I'd wake up with so much excitement getting ready for that big day when Santa Claus was coming. Well, I remember one evening, my dad came home from work and told us as a family that he had purchased a small parcel of land, about an acre and a half up in the mountains near Chico. And it was very close to a national forest. So it was a fairly remote area with a lot of natural wildlife and trees and the beauty of nature. And I always liked getting out into that kind of an area, even as an adult. I remember the night before the trip, they didn't tell us that we were going to be going the next day. But that morning, about 4 o'clock in the morning, my dad woke my sister and I up and told us to get our clothes on and that we were going on a trip. And I remember that we probably slept at least half of the way there and woke up and did the typical thing kids do, teasing each other and driving my parents probably fairly crazy. It took a long time. It seemed like a long time, but technically it's probably about a 4 or 5 hour drive from where we lived in the Bay Area. But the first step we made when we got past Chico was at the home of a gentleman. His name was Pop Meekums. And Pop is the man who purchased this huge parcel of land, and then he divided it up into parcels and sold them off to friends and relatives and neighbors. I remember that day when we pulled into Pop's home. He had a small cabin that he had built that he would use on the weekends when he went up there. And my dad and I got out of the car. My sister and mom stayed in the car. And I made a beeline for the 2 dogs that he had there in the front yard because I was always a dog person. And that another thing that drove my mom and dad crazy is every time there was a stray somewhere, I'd bring them home. And I remember this one particular dog, a black Labrador Retriever, I call him Blackie, who just came to me just like we were best friends, wagging his tail. And the whole time my dad was talking to Pop, I was petting Blackie and becoming familiar with him. The other dogs seemed to be kind of a little bit away from us and didn't really want to be interacting that much. Well, we got back in the car and we took off on a somewhat of a dirt road. And the next thing I know, we were on fire trails. And I don't even know, couldn't give a guess if I tried to go there today. I couldn't even come close to where the property was located. But the fire trails, one way or another, sometimes they were there, sometimes they weren't. Some way or another, my father found the actual parcel where we were going to be camping that night. So we set up camp and had our dinner. And I remember that night we were going to sleep inside the car because we didn't have a tent, and my dad was a little bit concerned about wildlife and so on and so forth. So we decided to sleep in the car, and that night I had trouble sleeping again. I remember for some reason during the daytime it really wasn't that windy, but in the evening it got quite windy, and I remember the trees swaying back and forth, and it kind of reminded me of a movie I saw later in life, a Disney movie, where the trees seemed like they almost came to life. But I remember the sound of the wind, and I remember the kind of creaking of the trees as they were swaying back and forth, and it kind of scared me a little bit, to be quite frank with you. Well, the next morning, we all got up, and my mom was kind of scurrying around, and she hadn't really started breakfast yet, but she was kind of getting things in order, and my dad was getting ready. He was going to take off and go over and help one of the other gentlemen that had bought one of the parcels work on a cabin he was trying to build. So at the last minute, my dad looked at me and said, "Would you like to come with me?" Well, anytime my dad wanted me to do anything, I was right by his side. I love to do things with him, and I miss him now. He's gone, but we did a lot of things during the course of my life, and I always enjoyed spending time with him. So we took off and we went over to the place where the other people were camped and building the cabin, and the guys were getting kind of busy and hammering and sawing and this and that and the other thing, and I'm running around trying to help a little bit, but no matter what I did, it seemed like I was getting in the way. So I remember at one point my dad asked me, just stay close, but don't take off, but kind of stay out of the way. I don't want you to get hurt, and so on and so forth. Well, after a little while, I started getting hungry, and I remembered that my mom was going to be preparing breakfast back at the camp. So I finally asked my dad, I said, do you mind if I take off and go over to where mom's at? I was thinking in my mind it was fairly close, but we had gone by car, and so I guess it's a little bit further than I thought it was. So my father asked me if I knew, how to get back to the camp, and I said, I think so. And he said, well, just go here and here and here and turn here and turn there. And he gave me 3 or 4 different directions on which way I was supposed to go, and I'm kind of like excited about the fact that I'm going to be at 6 years old, be able to walk over to the camp by myself. But I told him, yeah, I know exactly how to get there. So off I went. I remember that the dirt in that area was made up of kind of a red powdery kind of dirt. And I was one of those kids that really enjoyed walking with my rain boots into the deepest puddle to see if I could get the water right up to the edge of the puddle, or the edge of my boot, I should say, but not let the water go in. Sometimes the water did go in, unfortunately, because I got in too deep. But I just loved being in the mud, being in the water, and now I found a new first love, the dirt. I could stomp my way in that dirt, and 2 or 3 inches of dust would go flying, and I would make these big imprints in the dirt, leaving my footprints. So off I went. I got down to the first turn, and I started thinking, and I'm pretty sure that I turned right here, and I'm trying to remember what my dad said, and I thought, well, it's got to be. No, it's got to be left. No, it's got to be right. I couldn't make up my mind which way to go, and I finally took off to the left, and I walked maybe 20, 30 feet, and I looked around, and I said, boy, this doesn't look right. And then I went back, and I looked the other way, and that didn't look right either, so I thought, well, it must be to the left. I'm sure that's what he said. So off I went on my journey, and I actually, to be quite frank with you, I don't know how many turns I made until all of a sudden I realized that I am not seeing things that look very familiar to me at this point. So I thought, well, I'll just try to go backwards, and I'll follow my footprints back to where I started, and then try to figure out where I go from there. Well, that's when I realized that I wasn't the only one that had walked on this road, and there were other footprints, and they were kind of, trampled, going in different directions, and I realized that my footprints were not the only footprints on the road. So I tried going back, and it seemed like I had made one extra turn, and I thought, this doesn't look familiar either. And then I thought, well, I must have to go down here and cut through. And I thought, well, you know what I'll do? I'll just cut through the forest. That way, I'll save some time. And by this point, I'm starting to realize that I don't exactly know where I'm at, and I don't want my dad to know that that I'm lost. So I cut through the forest, and I must have gone the wrong way or in the wrong angle, but no matter what I did, I could not find the fire trail. And by the time I had gone around trees and over rocks and so on and so forth, all of a sudden I stopped and I thought, okay, I was a little bit of a clearing. I looked around, and no matter which way I looked, I was turning around and looking, and I could not see anything that looked familiar. I thought, well, okay. I looked down at the ground. I thought, I'll just follow my footprints back. I realized again, the ground was not soft like it was on the fire trail. The ground was harder, and there was a kind of fern or something growing on the grass, a grassy fern, weed, or whatever you want to call it, fairly close to the ground, and it made it impossible to leave a footprint. At least there's nothing that I could see. And all of a sudden, it hit me. You are lost. You are totally and completely lost. I didn't know what to do at that point. And so I just sat there for a little bit crying, typical of a 6-year-old, I guess. And of course, that didn't help matters any. And then I started thinking about all those stories that my mother was telling us. I'm sure she only told them to us just simply to keep us close to camp, but she's talking about rattlesnakes and mountain lions and bears and all these things and good reasons for you to stay close to home, so to speak. Well, typically I wouldn't have really been bothered if I would have been somewhat near the camp, but at this point, totally lost, all of a sudden, all those warnings started coming back to me and haunting me. So for some reason, I started screaming at the top of my lungs, help, help, help. Somebody help me, please help me. Crying and crying and crying. And of course, the more tears that I shed, the more difficult it was to see where I was at or where I was going. And for some reason, I remember, and I used to run a lot when I was a little boy. I took off running. And I thought I was running in the right direction to try to get to where my dad was at. I don't know why, but I thought the quicker I can get there, this will end this journey that I'm going on that I'm not appreciating in any way whatsoever. So I continued to run. And then finally I stopped again and I started crying out again, help me, is anybody there, so on and so forth. And cried some more and again lost my vision because of all the tears and ran again. Well, I don't know how much time went by. I'm going to say probably 20 minutes to half an hour. You can go quite a distance when you're running. And I was going deeper and deeper into the national forest, which I didn't realize, but I was running away from anyone that could have possibly helped me. So finally, for some reason, I just stopped. And I sat down on a log and I cried some more. And then finally, I was kind of getting my composure and I looked up, and quite a distance away, I saw a dog, a black dog. And I thought, oh, he looked a little bit large and a little scary, to be honest with you. And I started thinking, of course, I thought he was a wolf initially, but then I realized, well, wolves aren't black as far as I can remember. And so I cautiously walked towards the dog, and then it hit me. Well, if there's a dog, there must be an owner. So I started calling out again, help me, I'm lost, I'm lost. And the dog, I noticed the dog, even from a distance, I could see the dog kind of cocked his head as if he was trying to understand what I was saying. So I began to walk closer and closer, and I'm thinking in my mind, as a little boy probably would, most boys, when you see a big dog, you just hope he's friendly. So it didn't seem like there was any owner around, and as finally got to where I got close enough to the dog, and I said, boy, that looks like that dog that I saw this morning, Blackie. And all of a sudden I realized it was him. And so I called him, and he ran over to me, and I pet him, and I grabbed his collar, and I thought, boy, I'm not letting go of this dog. That dog is going to protect me from wolves or rattlesnakes or bears or whatever. I kind of had a Lassie moment or a Rin Tin Tin moment where you have this very special dog that protects you from anything that might possibly attack you. And all of a sudden, Blackie was my Rin Tin Tin. Well, what happened was when I grabbed his collar, he broke away. Like he didn't want me to hold him by the collar. I couldn't understand why he would do that. So he ran away about 20 to 30 feet, and I called him again, and he wouldn't come to me. So I started walking up towards him, and just about the time I got to him, he took off and ran again, another 20 or 30 feet. And he stopped and sat down. Well, by this time, I'm starting to get angry. So now I'm yelling at the dog, and I'm telling him to stay and sit. And now I start running towards him, and he takes off and runs again. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, now I better not run, because if I do, I'm afraid he's going to take off, and I'm not going to have the dog, and I'll be even more lost. I have no idea what was going on here. So finally, I just kept following him. He kept stopping And the next thing I know, I don't even know how long it was. It was probably, I'm going to say probably a half an hour later. I looked up and there was a building. And I thought, well, what's that building I'm doing up here in the middle of nowhere? Because there was nothing up there, just forest, and that was it. And I realized that there was smoke coming out of the smokestack, and I thought, well, somebody must be there, or there wouldn't be a fire. Blackie ran over to the front porch of the building, and I followed the dog over there, and next thing I know, he took off, and he left me there. So I went up and I knocked on the door, and the lady came to the door. I'll never forget her face. And she looked at me, and she must have seen the tears and the dirt all over my face or whatever. And she said, "Are you okay? Are you lost?" And she says, "Why don't you come inside?" And I'll never forget, because her whole family was sitting at a table. It turned out to be the forest ranger for that area. And she was serving pancakes to her 4 other children, and she just served me up a great big pile of pancakes. And I was right in the middle of eating those pancakes when my father and 2 other men who were trying to find me came up to the ranger station asking for help to find me, and there I was. Well, looking back on this story, the amazing thing about this whole story was I realized that even now as an adult, I look back as a child. I didn't think about it at the time, but now I know that God never lost track of where I was. He seemed to know exactly where I was, and I believe to this day that he sent Blackie to save me. But the amazing thing about it, as I think about the story, is I was running here, and I was running there, and I was going around trees and over rocks and changing direction on multiple occasions. And how was it that God knew? If it wasn't God, how would the dog have known where to find me? And it seems like not only did he direct my path in a direction that I would intersect paths with Blackie, but he also sent Blackie in a direction and maybe even had to change his direction 2 or 3 times to keep up with me. But one way or the other, he allowed Blackie to find me, not only find me, but then lead me back to help where I could be saved. Well, you have these kind of experiences in life, and you start thinking about it, you start wondering how this all occurred, and you realize how much God loves you and how capable he is. Let me put it that way. Capable of being able to develop a solution for whatever you're going through. It was one of the most amazing experiences that I ever had as a child. I'll never forget it. And it's left this amazingly deep impression in my mind and my heart. And it was probably the first example of anything that I've ever experienced that helped me to build the faith that I have in God today. This is Lowell King asking you the most important question anyone will ever ask you in your entire life. Do you know him?